Most mornings in Hoboken started the same: the 6:32 PATH train rattling under the river, a lukewarm coffee balanced in my hand, and the quiet shuffle of people too tired to look up from their phones. By the time I stepped into Talaris Systems' downtown office, the building already smelled of ambition, espresso shots, and glass walls polished to a shine that made everyone look busier than they were. I preferred the hum of the server room. It didn't judge, didn't posture. The racks blinked like constellations I knew by heart. 15 years of architecture and patchwork, code written through snowstorms and blackouts, duct-taped into elegance until it became the backbone of a company the execs pretended ran on branding alone. That morning, Zeke wandered in, our newest intern, hair still damp from the shower, lanyard crooked like a child wearing his father's tie. He held a laptop against his chest and cleared his throat. Miss Marwick, quick. Question. Where's the on button for the API? I blinked, then set down my mug. He wasn't joking. APIs don't have on buttons. Zeke, I said evenly. They're endpoints, not coffee makers. His ears flushed red. He nodded, stammering apologies. But then, almost as if he couldn't help himself, he added, "Sorry, it's just, Mr. Hale said this whole system won't last another quarter anyway. So I thought maybe..." His voice trailed off. The words landed harder than they should have. Mr. Hale, the new CEO. He'd been in the building less than a month, and already he was telling interns my system was doomed. I forced a smile, waved Zeke back toward the bullpen, and turned to the monitor, though the code blurred before my eyes. 15 years of my life sat humming in those racks. The system wasn't just functional, it was the reason Talaris had survived its awkward adolescence. If Hale thought he could toss it aside with a soundbite, he didn't understand what he was touching. Or worse, he understood exactly and wanted it gone anyway. I reached for my notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote the date in bold. Whatever game had started. I wasn't going to forget the first move. The next morning, his face appeared at the all-hands meeting, framed by spotlights and confidence too smooth to be real. The first time I saw Victor Hale in action, it was like watching a man audition for his own biopic. The auditorium lights dimmed, music pulsed, and he strode onto the stage in a tailored navy suit that fit too perfectly, like it had been sculpted around his ego. Behind him, slides flipped with bold fonts and neon arrows, words like rebuild, disrupt, scale. He grinned like he owned oxygen. Talaris has been stuck in 2013, he declared, pacing with a microphone headset that made him look more tech evangelist than CEO. It's time to gut the legacy junk and build fresh, fast, lean, modular. The crowd clapped dutifully. I sat in the back row, hands folded, listening as he tossed around frameworks like confetti at a parade. Legacy junk. That was my work he was dismissing. The infrastructure that carried 90% of our recurring revenue. To him, it was dead weight. Later that week, during the quarterly review, I saw the first cut. My name gone from the architecture deck. The slide showcasing the system's uptime record now credited to engineering leadership. That wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. I clicked through the internal portal that night, and there it was, a new tag stamped across my private repo, under audit. No one else's work bore the mark, only mine. I cornered Victor after the session, asked why my repo had been flagged. He smiled the way people smile at toddlers asking about taxes. Standard process. Elena. Nothing personal. Just making sure our house is in order. I recognized the move. Not a cut with a blade, but the steady work of an eraser, scrubbing me from the margins until I disappeared altogether. Back in the server room, I jotted another note in my book. First the intern's warning. Now this. The pattern was too clean to be coincidence. A week later, HR asked me to step into their glass office for a casual chat. Marjorie from HR ushered me into one of those glass pods that pretended to offer privacy. She set her latte down, crossed her legs, and began with the sort of smile people rehearse in mirrors. "This is just a casual coaching session," she said, voice dripping with sugar. "A few concerns have come up. You've been described as too blunt in meetings, resistant to change." I folded my hands. "By whom?" She blinked, as if the question were impolite. "It's not about names, Elena. It's about growth. Tone matters as much as content." I stared at the condensation on the glass wall behind her, each droplet sliding like an egg timer. Marjorie didn't know code from clay, but she'd been sent to soften me for the guillotine. The irony was rich. That same week, my caching overhaul saved the company nearly $1 million in server costs at the all-hands. Victor congratulated Mason, his Stanford Golden Boy, for leading the optimization initiative. Mason read from my slides with the confidence of someone who thought syntax was a new exercise fad. No one corrected him. Later that evening, combing through commits, I found something worse. Mason had pushed a sequence into the repo, tagged with my initials. Only the timestamp gave him away logged while I was across the river on the PATH train. I didn't slam my desk. I didn't storm into his office. I opened my private archive, mirrored the logs, and pulled every trace of proof, line by line, timestamp by timestamp. I tucked the evidence into a folder labeled with one-word receipts. If they wanted to erase me, they would find the ink indelible. I closed my notebook, wrote the date, and underlined it twice. That night, while the city pulsed outside my Hoboken apartment, memory carried me back 15 years to a Brooklyn loft where this company had been nothing but cables on the floor and 3 whiteboards scrawled with dreams. 15 years earlier, Talaris wasn't a tower of glass in Manhattan. It was a rented loft in Brooklyn, ceilings that leaked when it rained and radiators that hissed like angry cats. We had 3 whiteboards, 2 busted space heaters, and a dream stitched together with ramen and caffeine. Back then, I was 30, a single mother juggling code and bedtime stories. While the others chased venture capital and craft beer, I pulled all-nighters with my daughter asleep on a beanbag chair beside my desk. When a blizzard knocked out half the city one Christmas Eve, the others went drinking in Williamsburg. I stayed, fingers numb inside my gloves, nursing the servers back to life. I kept Talaris alive that night, line by line, patch by patch. It was also when compliance first came knocking. A government client required a written intellectual property policy. No one wanted the chore. "You're meticulous, Elena," the CTO said, dropping a stack of templates on my desk. "Just draft something. Legal will skim it." So I did, night after night, in a Brooklyn cafe that smelled of burnt espresso and old textbooks. I combed through contracts, studied clauses, cross-referenced boilerplate with case law I barely understood. I typed until my wrists ached, my daughter coloring dinosaurs beside me. And there, tucked on page 4, I added a line. Section 2B, dry, precise, almost invisible. If an employee is terminated without cause, intellectual property rights to any proprietary system authored, developed, and maintained solely by said employee shall revert to the employee unless otherwise renegotiated in writing. Insurance, I told myself at the time. A lifeline for the engineer who had nothing but her code. The CTO signed without blinking. HR added their signature. I filed it, shut the folder, and never thought about it again. Until now. I closed my eyes in Hoboken 15 years later, the memory settling like dust on my chest. In my desk drawer sat a fireproof box, the kind no one bothered to ask about, and inside, the paper waited. The next morning, an invite landed in my inbox. Subject line, Alignment Final Review. The subject line sat in my inbox like a shard of glass. Alignment Final Review. No agenda, no attachments, just 50 minutes blocked on a Thursday evening. Attendees Victor Hale, Marjorie from HR, and Daniel Kraft, the company lawyer whose resume was longer than his patience. They weren't subtle. It was the digital equivalent of a knock on the shoulder from security. I stared at it for a long time, then closed my laptop without replying. Instead, I walked the short distance back to my Hoboken apartment, the river air sharp in my lungs, the city lights pressing against the windows like restless thoughts. In the corner of my bedroom closet sat a fireproof box, its paint scratched from years of moves. I slid it out, set it on the floor, and turned the lock. Inside were fragments of another life-old tax forms, my daughter's report cards, and a stack of corporate documents yellowed at the edges. I pulled out the folder marked Teleris 2010. The paper was heavier than I remembered. The ink faded but legible. And there, on page 4, was the sentence I had written in that Brooklyn cafe, Section 2B, the clause no one had cared about, the one signed by the original CTO, HR, and me. My hands didn't shake. I laid it flat on the desk, scanned each page with deliberate care, encrypted the file, and sent a copy to an attorney I trusted from a pro bono case years ago. Subject line: hold this for me, quietly. I made 2 printed duplicates, slid one into my leather folio, and tucked the other under a stack of utility bills where no one would think to look. Paper doesn't crash. Paper doesn't vanish. That night, I lay awake, the ceiling fan ticking overhead, replaying Victor's voice in my mind. He thought this would be easy. A signature, a handshake, a quiet exit. The next morning, I buttoned my blouse, tied my hair back, and took the train toward the glass tower. The boardroom was waiting. The boardroom on the 7th floor looked more like a showroom than a place for decisions. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, giving the city a stage it hadn't asked for. A long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lights, and the chairs felt more expensive than my first car. Victor was already waiting. Sleeves rolled up like he was auditioning for approachable leadership. Marjorie sat at his side, papers neatly stacked, her smile stretched taut and practiced. Daniel, the lawyer, flipped idly through a folder as though this were routine paperwork. Nothing more. I slid into the chair furthest from the door, folio resting on my lap. I kept my palms flat against the leather. Steady. Victor clasped his hands together as if he were about to deliver a sermon. "Elena, this isn't easy, but it's necessary," he began, voice smooth, rehearsed. "The board has decided to realign priorities. You've been a valuable contributor, but systems change, and so must we." He nodded toward Marjorie, who pushed a folder across the table. "This is a generous package," she said, eyes sparkling with feigned sympathy. 2 months severance, continuation of benefits, and of course, we'll need you to sign the standard intellectual property reaffirmation, purely procedural. Victor leaned back, smirking. "Our IP policy is airtight. I wrote it myself after the acquisition. So this is just a formality." I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't even glance at it. Instead, I folded my hands neatly, one over the other, and let the silence gather in the room. Victor expected pleading. Marjorie expected gratitude. Daniel expected boredom. None of them expected stillness. I caught Daniel's eyes flick toward me, curious, then quickly back to his notes. Victor's voice filled the void again, heavier now. "If you're ready, we can wrap this up today." I let the quiet stretch until even the hum of the city outside felt louder than his certainty. Then, slowly, I adjusted the folio on my lap, my thumb brushing against the edge of the document inside. The room hadn't realized yet, but the air was about to shift. I lifted the folio from my lap, placed it gently on the polished wood, and slid the folder toward Daniel. The weight of paper crossing the table was heavier than any speech I could have given. "Page 4, I said evenly. "Section 2B, Victor chuckled. "The sound brittle. Come on, Elena. We sunsetted those dinosaur policies ages ago. My rewrite cleaned all that up, but Daniel adjusted his glasses, flipped through the pages, and stopped. His brow furrowed. He read once, then again, lips moving silently. The flush drained from his face until he looked as if the fluorescent lights were leaching the color from him. This was never revoked," he murmured. Victor leaned forward. "That's impossible." The new policy superseded everything. Daniel shook his head, eyes still on the page. No, the language was reused. Section 2B carried through. Marjorie's smile snapped like a rubber band. Her hands fidgeted with the folder in front of her, nails clicking against the paper. Victor's face darkened. He slammed a palm against the table, the sound ricocheting off the glass walls. "This is nonsense," he barked. "A clerical oversight. At best. It won't hold." But I didn't flinch. I sat with my back straight, hands folded neatly in my lap, letting the silence say what I didn't need to. Daniel kept scanning, flipping to the signature lines, tracing the dates with a trembling finger. Signed by the original CTO, HR and Elena. He said quietly, "Still valid." Victor scoffed, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a crack in the armor. He knew the ground beneath him had shifted. Marjorie tried for a placating tone, her voice thin. "Surely there's room for interpretation." But the truth was already loose in the room, unspooling thread by thread. I leaned back, steady, the hum of the city below pressing through the glass. My silence pressed harder than Victor's anger, and for the first time, it was clear who held the leverage. Daniel looked up slowly, meeting my eyes, and his next words carried the weight of inevitability. Daniel cleared his throat and read aloud, each word like a verdict. "In the event of termination without cause, intellectual property rights to any proprietary system authored, developed, and maintained solely by the employee shall revert to said employee unless otherwise renegotiated in writing." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Victor tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "This is outdated language. No one's going to take it seriously." Daniel didn't look up. "It's signed. It's never been rescinded. It's enforceable." Marjorie leaned toward him, her whisper barely containing panic. "Do you understand the exposure? Our SOC2 audit cites her stack. Vendor contracts reference her architecture. The investor deck has her diagrams word for word." Her voice trembled. "If her ownership reverts, every line becomes a liability." Victor's face flushed. He pushed back from the table, pacing the glass room like a caged animal. "We'll spin it. PR will bury it. No one outside this room has to know." I folded my hands calmly, waited for the right moment, then spoke. Too late. They froze. "I already shared a copy with counsel," I said evenly, "and an investor I trust." Quietly. "There will be no burying this." The silence was different now, no longer disbelief but recognition. They knew the fuse had already burned past their fingers. Victor slammed his fist on the table. "You're bluffing," but Daniel's eyes told him otherwise. He rubbed his temple, voice flat. "If she's distributed it externally, then concealment isn't an option. We'd risk securities violations on top of breach of contract. She's holding the cards." Marjorie's practiced smile was gone, replaced with something brittle. Victor's bravado sagged under the weight of inevitability. I leaned back, letting the city skyline reflect off the glass wall behind me. They wanted me erased. Instead, they were staring at the eraser marks on their own survival. Daniel finally exhaled, shoulders heavy. "So," he said slowly, turning toward me, "what will it take to resolve this?" Victor's face shone with sweat. The collar of his immaculate shirt wilted. His voice, stripped of bravado, rasped across the table. "What's your number?" I let the silence stretch until even the hum of the air system seemed louder than his breathing. Then I spoke, calm, deliberate, 7 figures. Not deferred, not stock promises cash, and a consulting agreement on my terms. I picked the projects. I set the hours. No gag clauses. No forced loyalty. Marjorie's pen slipped from her hand. Daniel didn't flinch. He studied me for a long moment, then gave a single, subdued nod. He understood the stakes without me. The system collapsed. Without the system, the company's lifeblood drained. Victor opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. Finally, a strangled protest. "That's extortion." I leaned in slightly. "No, Victor. That's compensation. For every midnight outage I patched while you were still polishing your MBA slides. For every line of code stolen and rebranded. For the fact that your empire rests on work you neither understand nor respect." His hands trembled against the table, fists half-formed but useless. The swagger that once filled the room was gone, replaced by the look of a man realizing the ground beneath him had never been his to stand on. Daniel cleared his throat, voice careful, resigned. "It's less than the cost of litigation, less than the fallout if investors discover non-compliance. She's not asking, she's stating terms." The words fell like a gavel. For the first time in 15 years, I watched them look at me not as an employee, not as a ghost in the server room, but as the foundation itself. Victor sagged back in his chair, deflated, eyes fixed on the polished wood grain as if it held an escape route. I sat still, my hands folded neatly. The folder closed once more. The silence was mine, and they knew it. Daniel finally pushed the severance folder aside, his gaze steady. "We'll draft it." And just like that, the company they thought they owned slipped quietly into my hands. I didn't stay. The ink dried on the buyout. The funds wired in neat digital numbers that glowed brighter than any severance package they had imagined. For the first time in years, I walked out of that glass tower without a badge, without a title, and without a trace of regret. 3 months later, I was in Boston, shaking hands in a quieter office with walls that held ideas instead of mirrors. The rival firm didn't want me for a title, they wanted me for the system. My system. We rebuilt it together, layer by layer, stripped of the compromises Talaris had buried it under. Stronger. Faster, smarter. It was alive again. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, Talaris began to unravel. Investors probed the gap left by my ownership clause. Auditors flagged inconsistencies. Compliance reports buckled under scrutiny. The headlines were merciless. The clause that sank a CEO, Victor's face, once plastered on glossy decks, now appeared alongside words like failure and arrogance. I read those articles on my balcony in Hoboken, a fresh mug of coffee warming my hands. The river shimmered, ferries cutting slow trails through the water. Beside me, my daughter leaned against the railing, no longer the child asleep on beanbags while I coded through the night. She smiled, proud in a way that said she finally saw what those men had missed all along. I didn't own Talaris anymore. I didn't need to. Ownership wasn't about paper or signatures. It was about control over the future you chose to build. And mine had just begun again. I set the mug down, inhaled the cool air, and let the city noise fade into something softer. They said I was done. I murmured, a quiet promise more than a boast. I was just getting started. And with that, I turned back inside, ready to write the next chapter not in their company, but in mine.